To persevere is to be steadfast in doing something despite how difficult it is to achieve success. In the Revolutionary War, Washington often had to fight to keep his army over 1,000 members. While being hounded by a British army with tens of thousands of soldiers, Washington's army lacked sufficient weapons. They lacked proper training and basic supplies. Disease plagued the soldiers frequently. Washington himself was even plagued by traitors and arrogant assisting generals who were trying to displace him. However, more than once in 1776, something happened that the Continental Army could only explain as the hand of God, helping them along the way. Financial support from France and the Netherlands, and military support from the French Army and Navy absolutely played a large part in the Continental Army victory. But in reality, it was Washington and the Army that won the war for American independence. The fate of the war and the Revolution rested on the Army, the Continental Army, not the Hudson River or the possession of New York or Philadelphia. They were key to victory. And it was Washington who held the army together and gave it spirit through the most desperate of times. At several crucial moments he had shown marked indecisiveness. He had made serious mistakes in judgment, but experience had been his great teacher from boyhood, and in his greatest test he learned steadily from experience. Above all, Washington never forgot what was at stake, and he never gave up. Again and again, in letters to Congress and to his officers, and in his general orders, he had called for perseverance and spirit, for patience and perseverance, for unremitting courage and perseverance. Without Washington's leadership and unrelenting perseverance, the Revolution almost certainly would have failed. As Nathanael Greene predicted as the war went on, he will be the deliverer of his own country. After 10 days encamped at Valley Forge, Washington was communicating with New Hampshire legislature, talking about how deficient and how exceedingly short they were of men. The commander-in-chief continued to express the urgent need for additional troops and supplies. Washington told the New Hampshire legislature to take action and to recruit more men. The outcome of the war, he stressed, depended on it. The suffering of the soldiers at Valley Forge and Washington's desperate attempts to rally Congress and the states to help them has become legend. This was the first large, prolonged war that the Continental Army endured. 9,000 men lived at Valley Forge for 6 months. During that time, 2,000 American soldiers died from cold, hunger, and disease. The troops who survived came out ready and disciplined, much more ready than the untrained men who had straggled into camp during the bitter December of 1777. When the Americans won their independence, all of the hardship was completely worth it. They had achieved their goal with the help of George Washington and with his perseverance and determination to achieve success in the war. Frederick Douglass is an unforgettable figure in African American history who displayed perseverance. Similar to Rosa Parks, a train conductor told Frederick Douglass to give up his seat to a white passenger. This wasn't in the South where Douglass was once a slave. It was in Massachusetts where Douglass had already fought to be a famous author. Instead of giving up his seat, Douglass gripped it as the conductor and others tried to pull him up. Years of persevering through manual labor had made him so strong. Douglass's grip ripped the seat out of the floor. This sums up Douglass's success: persistence. Douglass never gave up in fighting for his freedom, education, and equality. Once he achieved his own freedom, he continued that fight for others. His grandson once said, "No matter what happens in his life, he was persistent. Once he locked onto something, he never gave up." He was born into a slave family. His early life revolved around immense amounts of brutality. He lived with his grandmother because his mother worked too much to care for him. Eventually, he was separated from his grandmother as they moved to different plantations. His master made him eat out of a trough with other slave children. He saw slaves being whipped and was whipped himself. Seeing that he was more successful with a steady temper, he remained witty towards his masters. This earned him a chance to be a houseboy in Baltimore. It was there young Douglass first heard one of his masters, Sophia Auld, reading from the Bible. He was fascinated by the words and the stories, so Douglass asked her to teach him how to read. She was glad to teach Douglass to read, but when her husband found out, he was furious because teaching a slave to read was illegal. These lessons had to stop, but Douglass persisted. He would find boys who went to school and dared them to tell him what came after T in the alphabet. The boys would make fun of him because he wasn't going to school, so he would turn that around to get information from them. When running errands for his masters, he'd find scraps of paper in the street to read. He swapped food with other children if they taught him to read. He'd read newspapers or books he found lying around in the house until his masters caught him and beat him. The most influential book in Douglass's life was The Columbian Orator, which was a collection of classical speeches and rhetoric. Douglas bought the book with money earned in doing chores outside the home and coins found in the street. The book made the 15-year-old Douglas realize he no longer wanted to be a slave. He made plans to escape. By this time, Douglas was shipped to a new plantation. He made his first escape in 1836, but he wasn't sure where he'd go and returned. This taught him if you're going to succeed, you have to have a plan. He escaped again 2 years later with a clear plan of where he wanted to go. This time, he was successful. Douglas landed in New Bedford, Mass. The city was full of anti-slavery activism. Douglas attended meetings, watching how speakers worked their audience. Douglas was particularly impressed by activist William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison's speeches triggered Douglas to launch his own career as a speaker. In 1841, he made his first speech. A journalist covering the speech at the time wrote, "Flinty hearts were pierced, and colds one melted by his eloquence." Speaking out was dangerous for Douglas. The Fugitive Slave Act was in effect, so Douglas could be arrested and sent back to his master. To ensure his freedom, Douglas went to Europe, where he raised money for abolitionists. During this time, Douglas wrote The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself, to counter critics who thought Douglas's eloquence could never come from an ex-slave. The money he earned speaking and writing allowed Douglas a solid middle-class life. With slavery still a fact, he created an anti-slavery newspaper. Now that he was free, Douglas knew and acted upon his own ideas. The main lesson of Douglas's life is perseverance in the face of injustice. According to one supporter, he helped us to recognize we are all the same. All of us can contribute regardless of our circumstances, if you just work hard and believe. Atticus is a highly respected character in the novel To Kill a Mockingbird. He had spent time teaching his children important lessons in life and also to defend African Americans in Macomb. Atticus faced many prejudices against him and his profession, but he didn't let that stop him from doing his job. Atticus dared to go on against the opinions of the majority to help Tom Robinson. He knew that he would be mocked for defending an African American in court, since the whites are so racist. Atticus knew that the blacks are mostly kind and innocent, as described in the novel. Atticus pushed through and found so much proof to prove Tom innocent, from catching with his right hand, which didn't make sense with the mark on Mayala's face, and Tom's story that he told the court. He wasn't going to give up until the jury came to a consensus, but in the end, stereotypes won. Atticus even followed through with his job by staying with Tom Robinson one night to protect him from any gang or people who intended to kill him. He was almost killed, but fortunately, Scout Finch, his daughter, went up to talk to the gang of people and thus saved Atticus's life. This wasn't where Atticus's perseverance stopped. Mrs. Dubose often called him ugly names and foul language, such as nigger lover. However, Atticus didn't mind, as he knew that Mrs. Dubose had her own reasons to mock him and call him names. He even made Jem, who had previously offended Mrs. Dubose for calling Atticus ugly names, to apologize to her. Atticus knew clearly how Jem felt and the consequences he might have had, but he wanted Jem to learn to be a gentleman. Atticus knew what the proper thing to do was, and he was going to follow through and not break down his wall and become upset. Atticus was living in a difficult time where many people tried to force their own opinions upon you, but he didn't allow that to happen. He persevered and wouldn't let anyone change his mind.
Oh, this is the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this is the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Oh, this is the light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
Homesteaders were people who traveled to the western United States in order to find a new life. They were promised big things and new, amazing lives. However, in order to receive these things, they were forced to endure so much to get there. If they were to travel along the Oregon Trail, they often encountered deaths by disease, children were crushed by horses and buggies, and people drowned crossing the streams. Food was scarce, and starting anew was not an easy task. They faced language barriers and homesickness, and many were lucky to even make it all the way to the West. Homesteaders who persevered were rewarded with opportunities as rapid changes in transportation eased some of the hardships. 6 months after the Homestead Act was passed, the Railroad Act was signed, and by May 1869, a transcontinental railroad stretched across the frontier. The new railroads provided easy transportation for the homesteaders, and new immigrants were lured westward by railroad companies eager to sell off excess land at inflated prices. The new rail lines provided ready access to manufactured goods and catalog houses like Montgomery Ward, which offered farm tools, barbed wire, linens, weapons, and even houses delivered by the rails. These things and rewards at the end of grueling months of travel and hardships made persevering through worth it in the end. As these four characters have shown, never give up, push through to persevere through even the hardest of times. As Henry Wadsworth Longfellow once said, perseverance is a great element of success. If you only knock long enough and loud enough at the gate, you are sure to wake somebody up.